And now we're going to hand over to Philip Leslie, who's going to do our talk today. He has a message that will bless us, inspire us, and encourage us. So just welcome, Philip.
Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be live streaming into your lounge rooms or perhaps on your PC this morning. Look, when I was about 11 or 12 years old, I used to watch people on TV, and I used to think to myself, gee, I'd love to be on TV. But I had a fairly bad speech impediment at the time, so it didn't seem possible. So I made it. So here I am this morning at your place. God certainly has a sense of humour. Look, just before I start this morning, while I was preparing this talk, I've listened to a few other people, so just need to acknowledge my sources. One of them is a guy called Dave Hodgson from KI Investors, and another one, I listened to a really good talk by Bill Johnson a few weeks ago about sowing in a time of famine. So if some things are similar that I say this morning, you'll know where my sources are. So look, we're in quite unusual times now. You know, things are different. We're at home live streaming this morning. Things are quite different here this morning at the centre. But we're born for such a time as this. This is our time. This is when we're born. So we are born for such a time as this. One of my favourite stories in the Bible is about Esther. Most of you will know the story. And you'll remember that in the time of King Xerxes, he was looking for a new queen. And so he put an edict out throughout the country that all the beautiful young women should come to the court and to join his harem. And so when Esther came there, she was instructed by her, perhaps her older cousin or uncle, and his name was Mordecai, to not reveal that she was actually a Jew. And so she entered the harem, and she became very popular very quickly. She was obviously a beautiful young woman, but obviously she would have had a very good temperament. And she found favour with the king. And she became his queen. So we all know her now as Queen Esther. But as the story goes, one of the king's senior advisors, his name was Haman, he had a bit of an anti-Semitic tendency, and he wanted to see all the Jews annihilated. And when Mordecai, this is her uncle, found out about this, he called a severe fast, and he went round in sackcloth, and they weren't eating food. And so Esther heard about this, and she wanted to know why was Mordecai fasting like this. So she called him up to the palace. And so he explained to her the evil plan that had been hatched by Haman. And he wanted her to make a plea to the king, and to go to the king and make a plea on behalf of the Jewish people. But Esther explained to Mordecai, look, it's dangerous just to go into the king. No one can just go to see the king. Regardless of the fact that I'm the queen, I just cannot walk into the king unannounced or uninvited. And if I go in there uninvited and he doesn't point his scepter at me, then it's basically imprisonment or death. But Mordecai said a really interesting thing to her. He said to her, and we can read this in Esther 4:14. He was warning her, and he said, if you remain silent at this time, relief and the deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And then he went on to say, and who knows, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Look, when Esther first joined the harem and became queen, she would have had no idea of the important role that she was going to play in the important role that she would play in Jewish history. Basically, God had placed her in a position to save the Jewish people as a whole. Well, we now live in a time and a season of unusual events. I don't think you could call these events unprecedented, because there's always been plagues and illnesses throughout the history of man. But this is our plague, and this is our illness, and this is our economic famine that we find ourselves in. So we're all born for such a time as this. We're living in the 2020s. We're not born or living in the 1920s. Remember, when people lived in the 1920s, they were between World War I and World War II. And so people in the 1920s found themselves in a place where a lot of the young men had been killed in war, and they were financially devastated. And so they had to cope with that situation. We're not born in the 1820s, when the people through Europe were devastated after the Napoleonic Wars. They were financially devastated, and a lot of the young men and women had been killed in that time of war. So people found themselves struggling in a very difficult place. Imagine Winston Churchill. He entered Parliament 120 years ago, January 1900. And it wasn't until 40 years later that he became a wartime Prime Minister. So he entered in 1900, and 40 years later, he became Prime Minister of England, May 1940. And he served as a wartime Prime Minister. And in fact, he took over from Neville Chamberlain, because Neville Chamberlain didn't believe that there was going to be a war, or he believed that war could be avoided. But Churchill knew that it couldn't happen. And I don't think that Chamberlain possibly had the ticker for a war and just didn't want to be the wartime Prime Minister. So basically, war was thrust upon Winston Churchill. And as it turned out, he was the man for that season. He was the man for that time. In fact, in the First World War, he'd basically done a mediocre job. But by the time he got to the Second World War, through all the trials and things that he had gone through, he was the man for the time. And he basically brought the world together, rallied the world together so that there was victory in 1945. So Churchill was born for such a time as this. So as Christians in a covenanted body of people, how do we rise up and meet the challenges that we're facing in 2020? There's lots of challenges for a Christian body like ours in 2020. Some of those challenges are basically just being a Christian these days is a challenge. But the biggest challenge, obviously, that's in our face right now is COVID-19. So we're facing challenges of lack of work and finances. And I know that there's some people in our body who are struggling in our wider family groups who are going to find this a very challenging time. And it's going to be a very challenging time for the poor in our country. And so I think it's something we're all going to need to be aware of. Even in our body, there are people who have lost jobs. People will be feeling isolated. People will be particularly unsure of their future. And many people I know are worried about how the economy is going to go. Look, it's okay now while we have a stimulus from our government, when people are getting support, but things will change and things will definitely become difficult when the stimulus finishes. But perhaps God's trying to get our attention at a personal level and at a corporate level. Many people are saying, I can't wait for things to go back to normal. But do we really want things to get back to normal? Perhaps God is teaching us some valuable lessons at this time so that we, as a body of people, perhaps we can create a new normal. Look, 20 years ago, Adriana and I, we faced a very difficult time, but we learned some valuable lessons in a time of great trial and stress in our life. And at the time, I didn't want to go through the trial. And in fact, at the time, I just wanted things to go back to what I considered to be normal beforehand. But when I realised that we were in the thick of it, I really prayed to God that I know we are going to go through a difficult time, but I want to learn something out of this. So I'm willing to do this, providing that I can learn something. So God began teaching us some valuable lessons. And most of you will know our testimony. I've given it before. But basically, by the time I was 40 years old, we were totally broke. It took bankruptcy, mine and Adriana's bankruptcy, for God to get our attention. In fact, I couldn't believe the position that I found myself in at 40 years old. I'd worked for 20 years and now I had nothing. But I wished at the time that things would go back to normal. But God was trying to teach us a new way of doing things His way and not going back to the things that we thought were normal. Look, 2 weeks ago, Richard touched on a theme of assignment. He mentioned the word assignment. Just touched on that theme. So I thought this morning I might just expand that theme a little bit. So when we were really struggling and we were financially ruined, we felt very strongly that God gave us an assignment. And that assignment was to put Him first in everything and develop intimacy with Him. To put Him first in our family, to put Him first in our business, to put Him first here at SOJ, and to put Him first in our finances, especially in the area of our tithes and offerings. Most of you already here will already understand what your assignment is, because by the very fact that you belong to a body such as ours, and most people are called to this body, just by that fact, you already understand that God's given you an assignment to belong to this body and get behind the vision of this body. But you'll also be developing a career, perhaps if you're young and going to uni, that's part of your assignment. You're a husband and wife, you're raising godly children, that's part of your assignment. And you're called here to this body to walk in this body with your family and to build relationships. This is all part of your assignment. So most of you will already understand that quite well. At the time when God gave us our assignment, Adriana and I felt very strongly that God was challenging us to prove how generous He could be. Even though we were totally broke and basically we were just surviving from week to week, God was calling us to prove how generous He could be in our life. So, we worked hard at changing our life. We worked hard at doing things God's way. And I worked very hard just basically finding the money so that we could survive week to week. And we did this for 7 or 8 years. We just kept assignment. We stayed on our assignment. We stayed mission true to our assignment for what seemed like a long period of time. We were in a famine, but God asked us to keep sowing in that time of famine. We kept tithing and we kept supporting the vision here at this body. And we felt God continuously challenging us to keep sowing our finances into the kingdom, even though it was a time of famine for us in our personal life. By 2007 and 2008, the GFC hit the world, like global financial crisis. And those of you who can remember, it was a pretty devastating time economically. And I remember one morning, a friend of mine rang me while I was travelling to work, and he told me that he just lost $600,000 on the stock market. And when he told me that, at first I was really gripped with fear, because we were only just starting to come out of our financial wilderness by 2007. And I was just struck with fear. I didn't want to kind of go back into that wilderness again. We were just getting on our feet again. But amazingly, we found ourselves in our business, our business just kept growing, and our business just kept coming out of this financial wilderness that we'd been into for a long time. And we began to reap a harvest. It was only years later, in fact, it was probably earlier this year, Adriana and I were talking about it and trying to pinpoint why had we come out of that difficult economic time when the global financial crisis hit. We were coming out of an economic crisis. And we realised that it's because we had stayed true to our assignment. God had given us an assignment and we had stayed mission true and we stayed on our assignment. And that assignment was to develop intimacy with Him by putting Him first in everything. We put Him first in our family. We put Him first in our business. We put Him first here at SOJ. And we put Him first in our finances, especially in the area of tithes and offerings. Even though we had been in a time of famine for many years after our bankruptcy, we continued to sow into the kingdom, regardless of what was going on around us. And then during a time of worldwide financial crisis, we were reaping a harvest. Because we had maintained our assignment, God was faithful to us. And it reminded me of Psalm 126, and amazingly, Adriana read the same psalm out this morning. And Psalm 126, 5-6 goes, "Those who sow with tears and will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaths with them." And basically, that's what was happening to us. We were sowing with tears because it would have been easier to keep that money at that time when we really needed that financial help. So God called us to keep sowing our finances into his kingdom. So we were sowing in tears, but we reaped with songs of joy. As it turned out, bankruptcy in the year 2000 turned out to be the most profitable thing that ever happened to me, mostly because I learnt some lessons. And I learned very valuable lessons that have stayed with me this whole time. That God is faithful, God does care about us, and he does want to see us progress if we stay on our assignment that he's given to us. And we don't look to the right and we don't look to the left. We allowed God to take control of significant areas of our life. And I was reflecting on it a bit, and I thought it was a little bit like the story of Isaac from the Old Testament. He stayed on his assignment and he sowed in faith. Even in a time of famine, he reaped a harvest. Isaac's assignment was basically to follow his father Abraham's footsteps. His father had begun, and he was to carry on and build a great nation. And then God spelled out his assignment to him very specifically in Genesis 26, 1-6. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, my instructions." So Isaac stayed in Gerar. Now that would have been difficult because the Philistines were never all that friendly to the Hebrews, as we know. But we go a little further down to Genesis 26, 12-13. And it says that Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year he reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. Now he stayed on assignment. God clearly gave him his assignment in Genesis 26, 1-6. And by the time we get down to Genesis 26, 12-13, he was reaping a harvest. He was reaping 100-fold, even though he was sowing in a time of famine. And that must have been an extraordinary testimony to the people of Gerar, that here comes somebody into our land and he's sowing, and we can't sow. This is a time of famine and we won't sow. But Isaac was sowing and began reaping a harvest. In fact, he reaped such a harvest that the Philistines wanted him out of the land. He became too wealthy and strong for them. Isaac did not look on the circumstances around him. He kept his eyes on the Lord. He kept his eyes on the assignment that God gave him. He planted in a time of famine and he reaped a harvest. He was not trying to go back to normal or to go back to things as they were before. He allowed God to show him a new normal. Look, we're now living in a time of uncertainty due to COVID-19. But we're very fortunate that we live in a country that does actually look after its people, and we may, what happens here in our country will be possibly milder than what may happen in other countries. But some people here have lost their jobs. And I know some people must be feeling very apprehensive about their economic future. But you shouldn't doubt that God is not going to look after you. In the future here in this country, there will be many poor people to feed and people to look after. But many of you have already been sowing into the kingdom for many years, and as such, you should be very confident that God will look after you and put you in a place where you are then able to look after the poor around you. So don't miss this opportunity to allow God to get your attention and to make some changes in your life. Don't be wishing that you could go back to normal. Sometimes it's adversity in our life that polishes the gemstone within us. It's that adversity, if we allow it, will help us to grow and change. And God's probably trying to make a change in most of our lives. So we shouldn't want or wish to go back to what was normal before. We should be looking for what is the new normal. Look, in a time of economic uncertainty, it's counterintuitive to give away our finances to help the poor and to look after other people. It just doesn't make sense in a world that's trying to grab everything and hoard things. When people say, like, hold on to what you have or go and get more and keep it just in case we run out of supplies. It doesn't make sense. But God's kingdom is an upside-down kingdom. So things don't always work in God's kingdom the way they work out in the real world. So we need to be a people who trust in God's provision. We need to be a people who trust in doing things God's way and staying on the assignment that God has given us. There's going to be many opportunities now and over the next few years to sow into the lives of others with our time and our love and also our finances. So don't miss this opportunity to sow into the lives of others who are experiencing hardship. Don't miss this opportunity to sow into, during a time of famine, a time of economic uncertainty, don't miss this opportunity to sow into causes like community care, or don't miss this opportunity to sow into the refugee program. Don't miss this opportunity to sow into your neighbours, financially even, with your neighbours, or in love, care and concern. You'll reap a harvest. If you sow love, you will reap love. If you sow care, you will reap care 100-fold. Just as Isaac sowed in a time of famine, that's what God would call us to do, because we are a people of faith. Sow into your local barista. Don't stop buying his coffee. You'll bless him, okay? My hairdresser, 6 weeks ago, I was due for an appointment and I didn't want to go because I didn't know how the whole COVID thing was going to play out. So I rang him and said, and I didn't get him, I got his one of his staff. And I said to the girl, look, I just want to cancel my appointment. I can't come in because I'm just concerned about the whole COVID thing, how it's falling out. And she said, oh, that's okay, Phil, because lots of people have cancelled. But I said to her, no, but I want to pay. I can't come in, but I want to pay. And she began crying over the phone. Now, I've been trying to minister the gospel to those two for 20 years that I've been going to his to get my hair cut there, and I can't break through. But that broke through, okay? Because now the love of God is coming right into his shop, okay? So if you get the opportunity to do that, okay? Sow in this time of famine. It will speak volumes to the rest of the world. Most of us will probably get back on our feet quite easily financially, but many people are actually going to fall through the cracks, and we need to be aware of that. And we need to be aware that and this centre here is going to be very important for the social fabric of Sydney and beyond. I think that we're going to actually see an increase in assistance through Food Bank, the refugee program and counselling. But this is our time to sow into the lives of others and our time to sow the love of Christ through our care and our concern. We are born for such a time as this. SOJ is here for such a time as this, just as Esther had her time and just as Winston Churchill had his time. This is our time. We are born for a time such as this. Don't miss this opportunity to allow God to change your life. Don't miss this opportunity to sow into the lives of others through your love and your service and your finances at this time of famine. We are born for a time such as this. Servants of Jesus was established 30 years ago for a time such as this. That's an extraordinary thing to think about. Can you imagine in 2070, in 50 years' time, when SOJ is still running and all us old geezers have gone, there'll be new leadership, but they'll be facing their own struggles. And they're going to look back to the great plague of 2020, and they'll be looking back and they're saying, how did those people cope with that situation? And you know what they should find? They should find that the leadership then and the people then, they stayed on assignment. God called them to do something and they did it and they kept doing it, and that's what got them through. And didn't SOJ prosper at that time? It'll be a marker, it'll be a benchmark for people in the future, SOJ, to follow. So what should our new normal be? A new normal should be growing in intimacy with God, growing in our time that we spend with the Lord in our private time. Trusting in God's provision should be the new normal. Rising up to meet the needs of others should be our new normal. And sowing in a time of famine should be our new normal. So let's not go back to the way things were before. I bless you. I pray the Lord blesses you. I pray the Lord keeps you. I pray the Lord would have his face shine upon you.